The first scream in Tillamook that winter was not heard. It was imagined in the way the dairy fog clung to fences, in how a single porch light at the Fletch place stuttered like a heart, unsure if it wanted to keep beating. Cows breathed steam into the dawn, and a stray rooster crowed late, as if time itself had been confused by what lived behind those warped boards. Gravel popped under tires when a county sedan stopped at the gate, and the gate stayed shut. A chill traveled low among the blackberry brambles. Something in them seemed to listen. Inside the sedan, Miss Clara Jensen kept her hand steady, but her pen tapped once against the clipboard. The pen tap was small, yet it filled the car. She had the complaint in triplicate, a boy at school changing names the way others changed winter coats. The postmaster had noticed odd parcels, no return addresses, identical handwriting. The store owner, normally chatty, had cut the radio down when the farm was mentioned. Across the field, a window drape lifted and fell with a cautious fingertip. Then nothing. The gate latch resisted, rusted stiff, and she tasted iron in the air. Wind combed through the alders, and a blue jay broke into a startled flight. The farmhouse wore the color of rainwater, and every nail seemed driven by a hand that would never apologize. Elmer Fletch, 71, stepped into view with boots that did not squeak and eyes that did not blink until he had accounted for Clara's breath. He did not say welcome. He did not say anything. His jaw moved as if he were counting silently. For those listening, the narrator reminds, if stories like this resonate, subscribing and leaving a comment helps bring more hidden histories to light. The sentence hangs like condensation on a window before being wiped by the sleeve of the day. Clara proceeded. A smell of damp feed mingled with stove ash, and a child's cough clicked somewhere beyond the hall. A match struggled, failed, then caught, and the lamp's wick drew the room into a tight, watchful circle. Elmer's hands were clean in the way stone is clean, scrubbed of softness. Around 200 marks on a faded calendar hung above the sink, birthdays and first snows and nameless Sundays. Then, abruptly, nothing for 3 years. He noticed where her eyes fell and slid a heavy saucepan over the nail that held the calendar. A boy's jacket, 2 sizes too small, waited on a peg with a name stitched inside that had been unpicked and stitched again. On the table, a ledger bound with twine, the corners oily from fingers. He put his palm on it the way a man holds a restless bird. When he left to fetch coffee, Clara lifted the twine. The pages smelled of root cellar and glue. Inside were the seasons of a family written as equations. Mary becomes June. June becomes Ruth. Riley becomes Nolan, then becomes Riley again. A column titled Harvest was followed by initials and crude measurements not of crop but of height and weight. The numbers rose and dipped like a fever curve. Beneath the ledger, folded brown paper crackled. She unfolded it to reveal a map of the back pasture with tiny crosses penciled into the margins. Too close to the creek for drainage, too far from any animal path to be convenient. Out by the pump, a jar was buried where the map said it would be, the lid glinting through thin soil. The ground smelled of wet coin. Clara dug with her hands until her knuckles stung and lifted the jar into the light. Inside, labels floated in cloudy water, bleeding ink like bruises, bits of cloth with names sewn and unsewn, dates rubbed down to ghosts. A single scrap clung to the glass, half legible, trembling in her grip as if it wanted to speak and dared not. The scrap said his name, and it said the year he had tried to leave. The scrap said Riley. Morning held its breath above the pasture as mist unspooled from the creek, and a single fly circled the jar lid like it knew where grief was kept. A fence wire twanged in the wind, a note thin enough to cut skin. The house watched from its tilted porch, clapboards scabbed with old paint, while crows parceled out the field like jurors taking seats. Inside Clara's coat, the paper scrap warmed against her pulse as if the name itself carried heat. She walked back to the door and knocked with 2 knuckles, then with 3, counting her courage in quiet beats. A metal milk pail rolled and settled somewhere in the dark of the mudroom. Floor dust rose and sank as though the house were breathing. Elmer appeared with a cigarette unlit and broke it clean in half without looking down. Small shards of tobacco freckled the sill. He asked nothing about the jar. He asked about the road conditions, the rain, the price of hay, anything that lived away from his threshold. When Clara mentioned the school and the boy who could not keep his own name, Elmer's tongue pressed at a gum line as though testing a bad tooth. She asked to see the rooms the children used. He led her past a nail hammered sideways into a door frame. A length of twine still knotted there, as if it had once held back a curtain or a person. The hallway smelled faintly of iodine and laundry gone cold. In the first room, a pallet bed held 4 thin quilts, hand-stitched with initials that did not match. On a shelf, a mason jar captive with marbles clicked against glass when the floorboard gave. A pair of boots waited beneath the bed, toes scuffed to the same crescent on both shoes, as if the wearer stopped hard, often. At the second doorway, a draft slipped under her skirt and carried with it a high sweetness, like old peaches left in a pantry. A wooden crib stood against the wall, half-dismantled screws cupped in a saucer. A mirror faced the wall. Its backing showed water stains that resembled unblinking eyes. Pinned beside it, a strip of muslin with letters basted in red thread. R became N, N became R again. The same letters she had read in the ledger. Her throat tightened. The suspicion she had driven out to confirm swelled beyond paperwork. It took the shape of rooms and stains and the quiet choreography of concealment. She steadied her voice. "How many live here now?" she asked. Elmer's shoulders lifted, dropped. He mentioned daughters in a manner that treated them like outbuildings. There, useful, weathered. He said no boys remained. He said Riley had a gift for disappearing. As he spoke, a board above them clicked, one step, then another. Then silence that felt arranged. Clara's hand found the scrap in her pocket again, her thumb reading the ridges of the frayed edge as if it were braille for warning. By the stove, an enamel pot fussed at a low boil, lid ticking. Elmer reached to lower the flame and left his wrist exposed, a pale groove where rope had once rested, not as a threat but as a habit. Clara pictured the map's penciled crosses and tasted the metal of the jar water in the back of her mouth. For those watching closely, the details were beginning to align, and with them a duty that would not defer. If you want more hidden cases that drag truth from places like this, keep close. Lend your attention to the ones who vanish between names. A drawer squealed open. He handed her a folded certificate, edges crisp, paper heavy. The county seal shone gold in the dim kitchen. A birth record, official, recent, bearing the name Riley Fletch, 16, guardian, Elmer Fletch. The line for mother was left blank and stamped unknown. Clara knew the boy had been enrolled last fall under a different last name entirely. Her breath thinned. The document said one thing and the jar said another. Either the boy had been pulled back into the house or the house had learned to forge the world that should have saved him. A soft knock came from behind the pantry wall, 3 taps spaced like a coded plea, and the flame beneath the pot trembled. A whisper threaded through the slats. A girl's voice rasped thin with caution. "Don't let him send the boy back." The whisper thinned and slipped away, swallowed by the pantry's dry wood hush, while a moth touched the lamp glass and left a powdery comma on the glow. Clara did not turn her head. She kept her gaze on Elmer's hands, which hovered above the stove as if warming themselves on control. A spoon clicked once against enamel. The sound had the neatness of a tick in a ledger. Somewhere beneath the floor, the pipework exhaled a tired breath that could be mistaken for a child's. Outside, a pickup rolled past slow, its bed rattling with chains. The driver's cap stayed low. His eyes weighed the porch but did not stop. A hound barked far off, then cut itself short like a warning edited mid-sentence. Elmer asked Clara to sit. He set 2 cups on the table, one slightly chipped, and placed her cup just shy of her reach. His posture promised patience, the sort a man wears when he believes time works for him. She thanked him and did not drink. Her thumb found the jar scrape in her coat pocket and pressed until pain argued for clarity. At the county building hours later, a registrar named Mrs. Halverson cranked the microfilm reader with careful fingers. The machine hummed. A fluorescent bulb held its breath. In the slow river of records, names slid past. Births, deaths, marriages, that ordinary arithmetic of a place. Then came the first catch, Riley Fletch. Male, guardian Elmer Fletch. Mother listed as unknown. A month later, by county count, another entry unspooled. Riley Fletch, male, identical details, a second beginning stamped with the same ink, the same curve on the F in Fletch. The paper stuttered with the registrar's foot, and the bulb flickered like doubt acquiring evidence. A deputy fetched the paper ledgers for earlier years. There, too, the pattern. Girls renamed after seasons, boys reborn on schedule, as if late harvests could be corrected by repeating them. A corner of one page bore a grease print shaped like a thumb with a scar across it. When Clara saw Elmer later, the same small scar crossed his right thumb like a pale stitch. The registrar's rubber stamp kissed an affidavit. The sound made the table tremble. In the hallway, a soda machine clunked and settled. The town's ordinary noises felt indecent beside the arithmetic of erasures. Back at the farm, afternoon poured thin as tea. A cloud bank pressed low over the spruce line. Starlings stitched and unstitched their pattern above the silo. Clara stood near the pantry. She reached along the plank seam and found a shiver in the wood, a slat that gave to a slight push. Dust rose in a soft gust that tasted of cinnamon and neglect. Behind the panel waited a crawl space with a quilt rolled tight and a chipped mug holding a toothbrush trimmed short to its bristles. On the inner face of the plank, someone had penciled hatch marks, weeks, maybe months, and a single word, stay. Elmer's boots rapped once behind her. He said the pantry boards warped in summer, that the wind talked nonsense through old houses. He smiled with his lips, but not his cheeks. She asked where the daughters were. He said canning pears at a neighbor's, and named a road that did not exist on the county map. As he spoke, a girl's shadow loosened from the stairwell and retreated like a tide, her braid catching briefly in a splinter and leaving a brown hair threaded in the wood. Clara pinched it free and slipped it into her folder, a small living line. Evening gathered fast. The kitchen clock hiccuped and resumed, as if reminded to keep count. Clara told Elmer she would return with a colleague. His jaw arranged itself into quiet assent. On her way to the car, she paused by the burn barrel. Ash crusted the rim. Within lay the soft architecture of something recently undone, edges of envelopes, a corner of an official seal. The ghost of a name burned down to a single R. The air carried the faint, sour smell of bleach beneath the smoke, and the gravel under her shoe gave a brittle pop that sounded like a decision hardening. At dusk, the registrar called the sheriff, her voice low, her words plain. Duplicate births, irregular guardianship, a signature that copied itself over years. Clara stood by the road and watched the farmhouse sink into the blue hour until only that stubborn porch light held. In the back seat of her sedan, the jar tapped against its box with each rut in the lane like a restless clock. She did not know where Riley's body was, or if there was a body, but she knew what the papers meant. He wasn't missing. On paper, he had been born again. Dawn scratched a thin line over the dairy flats. while gulls drifted inland, their cries snagging on fence posts like torn cloth. A weak drizzle needled the windshield of the sheriff's cruiser as it idled by the Fletch gate. Diesel hung low, mixing with silage and the faint sting of bleach that never seemed to leave the place. The house wore mourning like a disguise. Even the porch boards kept their secrets under a varnish of damp. Sheriff Daly stood with his hat in his hand, not from respect but calculation. He watched Elmer roll a cigarette he would never light, the paper tight as a lie. Clara, ink smudge on her finger, kept the jar box tucked against her hip. It thumped once when an unseen door settled. In the distance, a silo ladder pinged as it cooled. The sound small and regular, like a patient tapping a ring on a bed rail. Across the ditch, two neighbor boys bicycled, then slowed and turned away, without speaking. They started with the easy places, barn loft, hay room, tack shed, moving through the farm the way a doctor moves through symptoms. Dust quivered in stripes of light and settled again on the same forgotten nails. Elmer answered each question as if he'd rehearsed the punctuation, a nod where a comma would be, a shrug where a period belonged. When asked about Riley, he claimed the boy had caught a ride north with loggers. At the store, the clerk found a scribbled receipt for boots in Riley's size, dated last week. It smelled like a trail laid carefully for hounds that could be tired by noon. A deputy uncoiled caution tape by the pump and followed Clara to the creek line where the penciled crosses had bred their questions. Mud took their steps and gave them back with reluctance, and a frog's complaint scampered into reeds. They found the mound quick enough, fresh turned, a hasty seam. Dalton's shovel bit, wet earth slumped. What rose first was burlap, then twine, then the shape beneath that set every throat tight. They braced. The sack split open onto a sheet of plastic. Out tumbled bones and leather, a boot heel, cloth with an R burned into it, and the white arc of a calf jaw. Not a boy at all. A false grave, salted with a child's belongings. The shovel rang against a buried tin, and inside lay the clipped county seal. From a birth certificate and the corner of an attendance slip from a school, Riley had entered under another name. Back at the house, Pastor Lyle hovered at the gate and made the sign he used at funerals he considered complicated. The grocer's delivery van crept by, the driver staring ahead as if the road might punish him for curiosity. In the kitchen, the clock's minute hand refused a notch, then lurched forward with a dry, irritated click. Clara's eyes returned to the pantry seam. She pressed. Wood sighed. The panel lifted as if the room itself were tired of collusion. Behind it, cool cellar breath drifted up. Potatoes sprouting pale nubs, vinegar in the thrum of the air. A candle on a saucer had burned itself into a lake and hardened. Its wick leaned like a spent reed. On the dirt floor, a nest of quilts held the dent of a small spine, and a drywall bucket cradled a tin cup. A comb with teeth missing, a pencil worn to a stubborn nub. On the inside wall, someone had written names in chalk, then scrubbed them and written them again, the letters losing fidelity each time until only first initials remained. A strand of brown braid ribboned across a nailhead, tied off with a knot like a promise no one should have to make. Elmer's boots stopped behind them. "Boarders," he said, too light. "Girls come through, we help them, that's charity." His voice wanted to make the cellar merely useful. The deputies held their breath, the house held its. Even the rain paused to count. Then, from behind the potato bin, a whisper rose, hoarse, deliberate, practiced in secrecy. It shaped each word with care, as if the wrong sound might summon punishment. "He made me change the name on the baby," the voice said, and the candle went out. Darkness folded the cellar into a single held breath. Someone's sleeve brushed clay. Above them, a floorboard creaked, as if a careful body had remembered how to step without a sound. Sheriff Daly struck a match. Its sulfur bloom tasted like a swallowed shout. The flame discovered the girl crouched behind the potato bin, hair braided to keep it from catching in hinges, eyes rimmed raw as if salt had lived there. She kept her palms open, empty, a gesture learned for safety. The room accepted the light grudgingly. Damp threaded through burlap sacks. A chill traced ankles first, then knees. Clara moved slow, showing the girl the jar with its drowned labels, as one might show proof to a frightened witness that the world could be written back into sense. The girl flinched at the glass and not at the law, so Clara set the jar aside. Footsteps stilled above. Elmer's weight made a different grammar on wood than anyone else's. Each step a kind of punctuation. The stove's pilot in the kitchen ticked twice, missed a beat, then steadied with a small, stubborn sigh. They led the girl up, the air changing from root sour to soap stale, and seated her near the window where daylight had teeth but not a bite. She said her name had been Ruth, and then not Ruth, and when she forgot which to use, she gave them a look that asked permission to exist. She kept touching the hollow at her throat, as if her voice could slip out and run. On her wrist, a thread bracelet, the color once red, now bleached to a tired pink, tightened when Elmer's boots crossed the threshold. He stood at the stove, hands idle, gaze careful in the way a hunter's is when the weather turns. The county doctor arrived without siren, a worn leather bag whispering against his coat. His glasses fogged on the first exhale, then cleared to reveal eyes shocked less by poverty than by pattern. He asked for a clean towel. Clara found one that smelled faintly of lye and orchard spray. The girl spoke in circles as if naming the path around the truth might keep it from setting. She described babies counted like calves, papers traded like feed slips, dates moved the way fence lines sometimes drift after a storm. When she faltered, the doctor's pen hesitated mid-word, ink gathering like a bruise at the nib. He finished a quiet exam, and with the bedside patience of someone who has seen too many kinds of harm, unfolded a sealed envelope from his bag. Inside, photographs, clinical spare, documented an older child with a ribbon scar along the chest, a surgical line that said he had once been saved from something he should never have had to meet. The doctor's jaw worked. He had performed that emergency years ago at a free clinic under a different surname brought in by a girl whose eyes looked very much like this Ruth's. The hospital had mailed a follow-up to a P.O. box. It returned, stamped unclaimed. He placed the envelope on the table between them like a small, blunt wether. "I think your Riley lived," he said, voice kept low so the ceiling wouldn't learn it. He was treated under another name. The scar would be straight as a ruler. The room tightened. Outside, a neighbor's shutter snapped closed. A cat yowled once, then decided against more noise. The pastor lingered on the porch, but did not knock. He stared at his hands as if palms could absolve. Ruth took a breath that sounded like permission. She told them where the boys waited when they tried to leave. An equipment shed near the cedar windbreak, with a feed chute that opened onto the ditch that lost itself under the road. "He changes words," she said, "but the paths stay the same." The deputies moved, one to the back lot, one to the road, voices brief on the radio, gravel giving under their boots like brittle promises. Clara steadied Ruth's shoulders, the girl light as a fact not yet entered into record. If there's a moment when a community must choose between comfort and truth, it looks like a porch where nobody knocks and a window where everyone watches. If you believe that buried histories deserve daylight, leave your voice here. Say that the hidden should not stay hidden, even when uncovering it stings. Elmer reached for the kettle with a hand that shook for the first time. Steam ribboned up, smelling of old tin and impatience. He smiled as if the afternoon were visiting and not investigation. "You folks done?" he asked. From the backfield, a deputy called out, not loud but sharp enough to find every ear in the house. "Got something," the voice carried, a pack with a school book inside, and a shirt with his name still stitched true. The deputy held the canvas bag up by 2 fingers. Rain tapped on the zipper like nervous code. The shirt sagged from the plastic as if the letters themselves were tired of surviving. Cedar needles ticked against the shed roof. A crow hopped sideways along the fence, judgmental as a note in the margin. When Clara opened the book, a dry paper breath rose, chalk and pencil and the faint sugar of a vending cookie someone had once eaten over a desk. On the inside cover, a pocket held a library card stamped 3 days prior, red ink still loud against the gray day. She slid a folded slip from between 2 pages, a torn square from a county map traced with a culvert line and 4 arrows, one ending in a circle near the cannery road. In the margin, someone had written 2 names in block letters and then hard scrubbed one away. Graphite dust rimmed Clara's thumb. She did not wipe it off. The deputy shook the shirt once and a bus transfer fell from the hem, a date that argued Riley had gone into town after all. The wind changed. The smell of silage surrendered to wet diesel as the sheriff's cruiser idled at the gate. At the Tillamook Public Library, warm air hurried their faces. A heater clacked unevenly, shivering dust motes into their brief moment of fame. The carpet carried a stubborn lemon cleaner, and the circulation desk bell wore a fingerprint halo where the town had pressed its patience. Miss Eloise Klein, hair set with the resolution of someone who believed in neat rows of facts, peered over her readers. She remembered a boy with 2 different signatures, both careful, each belonging to a jaw set hard with decision. He had asked for books on age of majority, and his hands shook when he pressed them flat to stop the page from trembling. Mid-afternoon held itself still. Rain stitched the windows. A man coughed in the newspaper aisle. A child in galoshes thumped a rhythm that made the fluorescent ballast hum in sympathy. Miss Klein produced the checkout log. Nolan J. had borrowed a pamphlet on workers' rights, an atlas, and a book of Oregon statutes with a page dog-eared on emancipation. He'd also used the typewriter, left ribbon impressions that spelled a name and then spelled it again with 1 letter altered. The librarian's chin lifted toward the payphone by the coat rack, where a phone book hung heavy with thumbed edges. Its coin slot glinted like an unfriendly eye. Clara checked the wastebasket beneath the typewriter and found a crumple with a carbon shadow, a half-filled Social Security application under the name Nolan Lines, answered in block letters that grew steadier by the box. In the top corner, a number had been copied from a directory, 7 digits written once, then underlined. The area exchange matched the Fletch farm. Clara's chest tightened with a feeling that was not surprise but a recognition of pattern. Even from a room full of exit signs, the boy had called home. They traced the culvert marks toward the cannery road, where the ditch slipped under the highway, the world narrowing to a concrete throat matted with grass. A jacket button shone like a damp star in the grit, same pewter as the shirts. Tire hiss whispered along asphalt. A semi aired its brakes, a sigh big enough to reset weather. The deputy's flashlight nibbled dark. It licked across fresher scuffs on the culvert lip, knees or palms or a last-second change of mind. Clara pictured Riley's straight scar under cloth, a ruler line over a heart that had not learned how to stop choosing hope. Back at the farm, Ruth stood at the window touching the faded thread at her wrist, tightening it until the skin paled. Elmer moved slower now, gestures careful, as if his body feared to betray the exact moment he understood what the library meant. He poured coffee and spilled no drops. The sheriff read the underlined number aloud. Elmer's eyes flicked toward the pantry once, then again. The house seemed to draw itself smaller around that gaze. A truck horn sounded from the road like a judgment. In the library, the bell rang. In the sheriff's office, a light blinked. Miss Klein's voice traveled over the line to Clara, hushed with that particular certainty Librarians keep for overdue truths. One more detail from the typewriter's impressions pressed deeper than the rest. Riley Fletch, calling home, payphone 12:42 p.m. And from the library's payphone, the boy had called only one number, Elmer's. Rain strung itself between the telephone poles like thin wire, and the lines sang a note you felt more than heard. A Pacific Northwest bell truck idled at the shoulder. Its amber beacon pulsed against the wet bark of alder. The lineman's sleeves darkened to the elbow, cranked open the gray junction box, and drew out a paper spool from the call register, the way a midwife eases a record of beats from a machine. Numbers marched in tidy columns, one repeated with stubborn devotion. The farmhouse line. Inside the kitchen, Elmer wiped his cup's rim with a cloth already clean. He stood as if the floor beneath him might give testimony. The sheriff laid the library's carbon scrap beside the county seal clipping, two small squares of paper arguing louder than voices. Ruth hovered by the window, palm flat to the glass, as if testing whether the world outside still had temperature. A neighbor's Chevy slowed at the gate, then reconsidered. Wipers wagged like a nervous denial. In towns like this, knowledge moved the way fog did, quietly, insisting. Midday narrowed to an edge. At the exchange office, a switchboard operator named Delia Morgan rolled her chair along the worn groove of her workday and pointed with a pencil to the 12:42 p.m. connection, payphone to farm. She didn't need the log to remember the call. The boy had breathed, as if counting steps between words. She heard a man answer, not a hello, but a time. 1 o'clock, then the soft clack of a receiver set down like a lid. Delia's throat worked around something unswallowed as she added that the farm line had dialed out moments later to a number at the cannery guard station, a favor owed perhaps, or a gate meant to lift. The pencil tip left a crescent on the page. Back at the house, Clara watched Elmer's fingers hover near the phone like bees undecided about a flower. The handset was heavy with the kind of silence that follows orders. She asked to see any devices that took messages. He shrugged toward the living room, its rugs combed into unnatural obedience. On a side table, a small answering machine waited, its plastic dull from years of being a secret. A cassette peered through smoked window, label blank. The doctor from earlier adjusted his glasses. His presence made the room stand straighter. They pressed play. The machine clicked, hissed, then gave a breath that belonged to a boy trying not to sound like one. "It's me," the voice said, steady in the way bravery sometimes borrows from terror. "I'm using a different name now. I'm not coming back if—" A scrape, as if a hand had covered the mouthpiece. Elmer's voice entered, unhurried, promising help if the boy met him where the culvert meets the cannery road. The tape whirred. Then another voice, female, rushed and thin. "Don't!" The machine spat leader and stopped. Ruth's bracelet bit her wrist. "He told us to rehearse," she said, too calm, "to make it sound like home." She moved to the pantry, reached behind the flour bin, and pulled a second cassette wrapped in waxed paper. On it, dates lined up in Elmer's numbers. Practice tapes. The sheriff's jaw hardened. The doctor's pen hovered, then wrote what no one wanted fixed to the page. Inducement, enticement, prearranged retrieval. Outside, the pastor finally stepped off the porch, then changed his mind. The boards complaining under his retreat. A deputy radioed from the cannery road. Tire ruts fresh, footprints that doubled back as if pursued. A candy wrapper stuck to the culvert lip, soggy but bright with the kind of hope sold in machines. The lineman held up the paper spool, the 1 o'clock outbound from the farm to a number in the logging yard, a ride timed to a boy's arrival. Patterns completed their grim geometry. Authority gathered itself. Elmer's hand twitched toward the machine as if he might swallow the evidence whole. Clara reached first, pocketed the tapes. The sheriff called for a warrant, his voice a flat steel meant to cut through damp. The house seemed to inhale. The clock refused to tick. Ruth whispered to the glass, fogging her own reflection into a ghost she could stand to see. By the time they stepped onto the porch, the drizzle had thickened to slant rain, and the crows had taken the fence like a jury reconvened. They would not return alone. Neighbors would watch from behind curtains. The operator would keep her pencil by the line. The lineman would wind his spool back into its tin. And the deputies would come with papers that made entry not a request, but a duty. By the time they came back with papers, the rope would already be tied. The deputies crested the lane with wipers ticking a metronome, and the warrant rode on the passenger seat like a small square certainty. Rain braided off the eaves in cold strands. A light in the upstairs hall burned a syrupy yellow that made the wet clapboards look bruised. A blue heron lifted from the ditch with a gruff croak, leaving its reflection trembling in the runoff. The gate hung open, not from welcome, but from having been decided for. Inside, the house had put itself in order. The kettle sat empty, lid cocked, the burner dead. Chairs tucked their legs under neatly. The telephone's cloth cord lay looped into a careful figure 8, a sailor's calm before water. A draft slipped through the stairwell and carried a smell of old rope and damp joists. Sheriff Daly climbed slow, hand sliding the rail that had been rubbed to silk by a lifetime of rehearsed steps. Ruth stood on the rug with her hands flat to her thighs, a posture like bracing for weather. Clara touched Ruth's shoulder, then let the hand fall. Even comfort felt like noise. They found him in the granary loft beyond the kitchen, where light came through knotholes like a map of small wounds. The beam took the weight as if this too had been practiced into the lumber. Elmer's boots dangled inches above a grain scoop. The rope bit into an old groove at his wrist where habit had left a memory. A bucket had tipped, split wheat across the floor into a sound like dry rain. The room smelled of twine and mineral and the sour gut of ending. A deputy steadied the ladder with palms that had spent a life on calm traffic stops. His throat worked once. Back downstairs, a state children's services supervisor named Ms. Arden Ward arrived with a case file fattened by postponements. Her umbrella shed beads that dotted the linoleum like a second, brief storm. She spoke in the tempo of policy, but her eyes kept skimming to Ruth's bracelet, to Clara's jar, to a wall calendar that had refused months, as if time could be vetoed. She acknowledged prior contacts, a report misfiled under a misspelling, a welfare visit delayed by flood, a school inquiry closed when the boy withdrew himself voluntarily. Paper had done what it was taught to do. It had protected form. A twist waited in the parlor, behind a portrait of a cow. Nailed crooked to cover damaged plaster, the deputies found a cavity lined with oilcloth. Inside, a billfold, with 3 different Social Security cards, all legit enough to pass a hurried glance, a stack of bus tickets torn in halves, and a pocket diary in a woman's hand that accounted for due dates as if inventory, initials instead of names, arrows to designate who stayed and who went. Tucked into the diary, a doctor's discharge note from 3 years earlier, pediatric unit post-surgery stable, bearing a boy's alias that matched the library's log. The margin carried a sentence written with a needle's thin insistence. He called at noon. He promised 1 o'clock. He will not go far. Neighbors gathered by increments, rain beads stitched to their coat shoulders. The pastor removed his hat. The store clerk held his in both hands like an apology. Someone said the word tragedy. Someone else said the word sin and let it drop without chasing it. Miss Ward, voice thinning to honesty, conceded what the quiet already knew. Agencies had circled but never landed. A consequence settled, not as justice, but as blame that made no one warmer. A formal review, a report that would speak sternly to timetables and training. Clara stepped onto the porch, the warrant limp now, the rope's memory still burning her palm where she had steadied it to be cut. She looked toward the cannery road where ditchwater hurried secrets away and thought of the culvert's concrete throat and a boy's precise block letters. Behind her, Ruth's voice reached the doorway, small and exact, as if reciting a route on a map she had memorized to survive. Riley said the cannery was only a stop. He told me the real meeting place was the kiln at the brickyard, after dark. Night gathered like clinker smoke over the disused yard, and the kiln loomed, a red brick throat that still remembered heat. Rain ticked on sheet metal, then slid in beads down the soot-black door. A stray dog shook itself and vanished between stacks of pallets. The sound left a ripple in the silence. Sheriff Daly's flashlight made cones through dust that tasted faintly of pennies. Clara and Ruth stood under the drip line, coats peppered with brick grit. The air here carried old fire, a warmth that didn't comfort. Inside, the kiln floor held a map of footprints, some new, some ghosting back after years of ash. An abandoned wheelbarrow listed on a flat tire. A thermos lay on its side, lid dented, smelling of metal and stale coffee. Near the firebox, someone had chalked 2 letters, RF, and rubbed them until only a blush remained. Ruth's breath fogged and broke. She pointed to a gap in the fire brick where mortar had fallen out like loose teeth. Clara reached in and drew out a tobacco tin wrapped in butcher paper and waxed string. The string snapped with a tired pop. Inside, a bus schedule creased to the column for Astoria. A folded strip of denim cuff with a tidy stitch line the length of a ruler, proof of the straight scar the doctor had named. A note on school-ruled paper, block. Letters pressed hard enough to ghost through. If late, follow the tide. The paper smelled faintly of library paste. A coin clinked against the tin bottom, a token from the town bus stamped with a salmon. Ruth's hands trembled. She pressed them under her elbows until the shaking had a pen. Midway through their search, a figure stepped from the shadow of the drying shed. A man with red-knuckled hands and a foreman's lamp clipped to his cap. He introduced himself as Vernon Pike, Night Watch, union rep on layoffs. His voice carried sand, his eyes carried ledger lines. He remembered a boy who waited by the kiln 3 nights running, then spoke with a truck driver who hauled clay out to the river plant. The driver had taken cash from an older man. Pike's jaw tipped toward the Fletch name without saying it to make room in the cab. Kid asked about fishing work on the coast, Pike said, worrying the strap on his glove. Said he had a different name for every door he tried, but only one he wanted to keep. Authority shifted. The sheriff radioed dispatch to query docks. In reply, a crackling voice read a Coast Guard log noting a juvenile who never boarded a trawler, despite a paid berth. The file named no names, just a description with a healed chest scar visible at a clinic on Pier Street, treated for stitches pulled in a scuffle. A paramedic had written, refused transport. The rain outside turned to strings. Drops beaded on Ruth's hair like sequins no one would wear in daylight. Back in town, a county grand jury met quietly and concluded loudly, with Elmer gone, charges thin on the rest. The pastor called it grief. A neighbor called it relief. The clerk called it Tuesday. The agency review wrote what reviews know how to write. Regrets and retraining, a promise to revisit rural protocols when roads are washed out and names refuse to stay still. Miss Ward filed emergency guardianship for the girls. Her pen clicked once, a metronome for resolve. None of it located the boy. Clara traced the chalk blush with a fingertip and watched it vanish on her skin. She pictured the culvert scuffs, the typewriter's carbon, the bus token stamped with a fish that always swims upriver. Ruth leaned against the kiln mouth, listening as if the bricks themselves might return a footfall. The night watchman moved off to make his rounds, lamp bobbing like a slow, patient star. They followed the map Riley left, past the cannery road, past the snag where the ditch gave up its rush and widened to a tide-fed gray, to the jetty where gulls became white punctuation on the dark. Wind hauled the ocean's breath inland, iodine and storm. The flashlight caught something at the black edge of rock, a paper bag weighted by a stone. Inside it, a second bus token and a library card stamped with a date that had not yet arrived. The note beneath was brief, a sentence made of resolve more than ink. Trying again. At the jetty's end, a pair of boots faced the sea. Gulls sawed the sky into ragged strips while the tide gnawed the basalt, patient as paperwork. The boots held their shape with rain pooled in the ankles. A scrap of fishing line snagged on an eyelet whispered against metal. The lighthouse swung its white blade across the chop, cutting the night into measured grief. Clara stepped close enough to smell salt in the leather and a bitter trace of fuel drifting from the harbor mouth. Ruth kept one palm on the rail, fingers whitening, as if holding the shoreline steady might slow the water's appetite. The jetty stones sweated with mist. Between them, tiny anemones held tight, their bright mouths closed like withheld names. Sheriff Daly's flashlight skimmed the black seams and found a folded paper wedged under a shard of brick, kiln red against sea gray. It was a note, damp soft, printed neat in block letters that did not apologize. If late, head north with morning tide. North meant highway, logging buses, cannery shifts in Astoria, boats that left before dawn. The deputy looked out over the water and measured distances the way men do when hope is a number. The ocean stared back with no arithmetic at all. They searched the rock shelf until the beam caught a slick of tar and a gull's feather stuck there. No body, no splash mark fixed by memory, only the noise of tide pulling pebbles like teeth in a glass. The Coast Guard log, reached by radio hiss, offered a thin mercy. At dawn, a boy with a straight chest scar had been seen on the pier's far end, arguing with a deckhand and then taking a ride east in a panel van. The deckhand remembered the way the boy checked his pocket twice, as if touching a future he wasn't sure he owned. Clara closed her eyes at the detail and opened them on Ruth's reflection. Wind-punished hair, jaw squared the way survival teaches. By mid-morning, the town adjusted its posture. At the cafe, spoons rang porcelain. Conversations rethreaded themselves around the space Riley left. Miss Ward filed the placements. Girls were moved to a house with a fence that meant protection instead of confinement. Morning sun drained rain from the Fletch porch. The law's yellow tape sagged like a tired sentence. In church, the pastor spoke softly of mercy. Outside, the store clerk stacked crates higher than usual, hiding bruised fruit at the bottom. People preferred order that the facts would not provide. Around 200 words in, the day made its own decision. Clara drove back to the farm for the last of the evidence. In the granary, the rope had been cut and coiled by a deputy into a neutral shape. Dust drifted in late light like quiet absolution. She boxed the ledger, the cassettes, the jar with its drowned names. As she lifted the jar, one label let go and rose within the water like a pale leaf. It caught against glass and held there, the letters unstitched almost to nothing and yet legible enough to hurt. Before she left, Clara stepped into the pasture alone. A sprinkler head ticked without water, rehearsing rain. Across the field, the barn's lean intensified, boards making a soft, tired conversation with wind. Ruth had pressed her thread bracelet into Clara's palm earlier, as if passing a lit match of will. Clara tied it to the fence wire, the knot held, small and stubborn. In another town file, a reviewer would later write of failures spread thin and blame spread thinner, and attach trainings that could not teach courage to arrive 5 minutes sooner. Evening flattened the farm into silhouette. The upstairs hall bulb finally died. Surrender slow, the glass cooling with a tiny sound like a decision undoing itself. Ocean air crept inland, carrying iodine and rumor. In the kitchen, someone had righted the fallen kettle. Its lid shivered when the house shifted, a quiet reminder that weight moves even after purpose ends. Ruth, from her new bed miles away, would sleep with one shoe on for weeks. The other she kept packed by the door. The doctor filed his addendum and erased the word inevitable before signing. At the jetty, night returned to claim what daylight had inspected. The boots remained salt drying to a pale crust that looked like frost and was not. A second bus token lay where the note had been, salmon stamped upon it, swimming forever against nothing. Clara set the jar on her passenger seat. The labels drifted and settled and drifted again with each turn in the road. She did not know if Riley had stepped onto a deck or into a different name, only that escaping and disappearing can look like the same act from shore. Back at the farm, wind worried the loose porch board into a slow, lonely clatter, and in the kiln's cool mouth the chalk blush finally let go and turned to dust.